Is Supergirl as bad as people are saying it is? I would say yes and no. It's a complicated film, and not complicated because it's interesting or even fun to think about or discuss. More complicated because it is fascinating to see how quickly DC has turned into the thing we thought it wouldn't be. And that is mostly just another generic superhero trope that we have seen for, at this point, decades. And I think that's where a lot of the disappointment comes from, at least for me, is when James Gunn took over the DCU. Superman seemed to be a relatively new spin on what a superhero film could be. Sure, there are tropes that we will probably forever see within the genre, but it did feel like there was a new angle, especially considering where we last saw Superman with Zack Snyder's version. But here comes Milly Alcock to save the day, presenting this new version of Kara, the cousin of Kal-El, playing Supergirl, the second film within the DCU. And unfortunately, this film does very little to separate itself from just another generic superhero film. It pretty much just repeats the blueprint that the MCU has been stuck in for years now. And it's really hard to say how we got to this point, other than for a while this seemed to work and this seemed to be good enough for audiences to go and watch these types of films. But it really feels like they just missed the mark in almost every element. Now, I will say Milly Alcock does a great job as Supergirl. She is probably the least problematic part of this film because she really isn't given much to work with. There are certain elements of this film that focus on her backstory and try to establish some sort of character arc for her to follow, but even those elements feel rather generic as it's a trope we have seen so many times before, even outside the superhero genre. She is suffering a great loss of her people and has turned into this essentially drunk party girl that really doesn't give any attention towards being a superhero until her dog is in trouble. So let's talk about that part for a bit, because this is where the movie gets fairly complicated for me, because on one hand I think it is pretty progressive to have a female-led superhero film, and even though we have seen that before, when you look at the online reaction before this film even came out, it's clear that this is still something very needed that people need to see. And with that, they decided to also tag on another major issue: children being bought and sold. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, including it within the plot of this film. However, it feels like this was such an afterthought, and especially for her own motivation within this film. Because, like I said, the main reason that she needs to go fight the bad guys is for her to go and save her dog. All the people that she is saving within the process kind of just seems like extra, and it doesn't seem like there was a real moment of her making that decision on her own. And I don't necessarily know how you fix that, but I think if you are going to include such a heavy subject matter, you have to handle it with more care than was given in this film, because it is one of the darkest things we have ever seen in a superhero movie. They are literally taking underage girls, calling them brides to create an all-male race. And once again, the only reason that she decides to help is because her dog was sick. Other elements that I found rather messy is we once again just take the most generic planets as set pieces to have our large action scenes on. It's gray, it's brown, it's boring, and I think it's very obvious why so many superhero films are set in these settings at this point, and that's basically because they don't want to spend the money to shoot in real places. And they also don't want to spend the money to properly create an exciting world to see on screen. It's one of the most boring, ugly things you could ever look at. And it really does just reek of them trying to get this out to make money and not actually put any effort into creating art. One of the more viral moments that has been trending this week is the needle drop towards the end fight scene, which features this really mellow, almost like 2000s YouTube cover of The Middle by Jimmy Eat World. And if up until this point the movie hasn't lost you, there's a high chance this is going to be the tipping point. It really brought me back to watching Captain Marvel for the first time, and all of a sudden Just a Girl by No Doubt is playing during the final fight scene, and then I'm once again reminded that these people do not trust us to understand the significance of having a female-led superhero film. They need to remind us point blank with the lyrics of these songs. And it's honestly condescending. It's condescending that we're not going to get the point. We need to be told that she is just a little girl in the middle of a ride. I definitely think a large part of this issue does come to the people making this movie. This was directed by Craig Gillespie, who has directed recent films such as The Money, Cruella, I, Tonya. And so there's a world where I see the vision of how a filmmaker like him could create an interesting Supergirl story. But on the other hand, just hire a woman director. The disconnect here feels very obvious on how they're not able to fully understand her point of view. This is a complex character living within this extended universe that you are trying to build out for future films, and it just feels like this was kind of an afterthought and there was very little effort put forward with this movie. So needless to say, I was rather disappointed with this film. I do not think this is the worst superhero film of all time. I would like to remind you of several dozen Marvel films we have seen recently. That being said, this definitely does lower my expectations for what the DCU has to offer with future entries. But I would love to hear what you have to think of Supergirl. So if you've seen it, let me know what you think, and I will see you next time.